Welcome to Normal Island. It's Friday. We're approaching the end of the week. I hope you've had a very good one. And tonight I'm once again joined by the very good friend of the show, Kevin Logan. Give us a smile or maybe a wave. I didn't get either, but that's good enough for me. A big thumbs up. Kevin, how are you doing?
Extraordinarily well. All the better for yourself.
Oh, God. You warms my heart so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I love your insights, but I also just love having you on. Just being in your presence makes me happy. Anyway, we've got some serious political stories to discuss tonight. These are what we will be discussing. Israeli football fans in violent clash in Amsterdam. Germany passes law to restrict public funding to critics of Israel. Yoav Gallant fired by Benjamin Netanyahu. And Liberals are learning all the wrong lessons from the Trump victory. As always, keep those comments coming in. About halfway through, we'll be reading them out. And if you haven't already, hit that like button. The algorithm really likes that, and we just do what the algorithm says. Anyways, on to our first story. Israeli football fans clashed with pro-Palestinian protesters after the Europa League match between Maccabi Tel Aviv and Ajax. Now, most of the media seem to be reporting that the Israeli football fans were being the ones attacked. This has actually prompted the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust to put out a statement. We are deeply alarmed and unequivocally condemn the anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish football fans in Amsterdam on Thursday evening. These abhorrent acts, which resulted in multiple injuries, are a stark reminder of the ongoing threats faced by Jewish people worldwide, even in public spaces. Occurring on the weekend of the Kristallnacht anniversary, these attacks serve as a grave warning that the fight against anti-Semitism remains urgent and vital. Now, the statement automatically assumes they were all Jewish, and that's why these attacks happened. Now, despite the entire media painting the Israeli football fans as the victims, what they don't report is what led up to these clashes. Now, this is a video of Israeli football fans chanting, and I quote, "Let the IDF win to fuck the Arabs." Now, according to Al Jazeera, tensions were bubbling for a couple of days, in which they also reports that the antagonism came from the Israeli football fans. Reporting from Amsterdam, Al Jazeera's Step Vasson said the clashes were the result of a build-up in tensions over a few days. Hundreds of supporters of Maccabi Tel Aviv came to Amsterdam, held a very vocal rally in the main square before the incident, waving Israeli flags, and also took down a Palestinian flag, she said. On Thursday, police said on social media that they were being particularly vigilant in the wake of politically charged incidents, including the tearing down of a Palestinian flag from a building. The Israeli fans instigated the violence after arriving in the city and attacking Palestinian supporters before the match, an Amsterdam City Council member said. They began attacking houses of people in Amsterdam with Palestinian flags, so that's actually where the violence started, Councilman Jazi Veldhuizen told Al Jazeera on Friday. As a reaction, Amsterdammers mobilised themselves and countered the attacks that started on Wednesday by the Maccabi hooligans. Now, none of us are surprised that the media have once again weaponized anti-Semitism, have allowed the narrative that Jewish football fans were attacked unchallenged. Kevin, again, no surprise from the media, but what do you make of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust getting involved and even mentioning the Kristallnacht?
I personally think it's an absolute disgrace that they would dare invoke a genuine example of genocidal, brutal hatred and violence, especially in the home city of Anne Frank in Amsterdam itself. The mood music of that couldn't be more poignant to defend far right hooliganism. And that's exactly what this is. Maccabi Tel Aviv, alongside the fact that Israel should have been sanctioned in the way that Russia has by being kicked out of international sport. Indeed, we have historical precedent for that with apartheid South Africa and how that can work. So that should have happened already. But regardless of that, the actual individual club itself has a past of doing this. This is what happens. We saw in the round of 16 game in the same tournament last year, they played Olympiakos in Piraeus, which is a suburb of Athens. And they attacked Arab fans there too. They deliberately go after and attack Arab people and Palestinian sort of supporters and try and antagonize in that way. They turned up as guests in a foreign city in Amsterdam, decided to be violent, politically charged all the way through, sing unbelievably genocidal songs, damage local property, and indeed try and take away people's freedom of rights, their freedom of speech by taking down their flags. Then inside the stadium, what is virtually unreported on, it seems, is that Ajax were holding a 1 minute silence before the game to honour the dead of the recent floods in eastern Spain, during which the entire minute was ruined by jeering and booing from the Maccabi Tel Aviv away supporters. They had been attacking and verbally accosting Amsterdammers in the street all day. So, I mean, for me, this is an issue of FAFO. Fuck around and find out. This is what happens. No one is suggesting that violence is the necessary go-to in all of these instances, of course, terms of service and all of that jazz. But ultimately, if you're going to act in this way, you can't be surprised when people defend themselves. To put it in terms that Zionists might understand, Amsterdam has a right to defend herself.
Very true. I'm sure there were some people there who were anti-Semitic. I mean, people need to know that people will jump on certain things for bad reasons, but the media has been completely one-sided. If the media were to be fair, at least show the other side. Now, I don't think it's an equilibrium, right? I don't think it's there was just as many anti-Semites there as there were pro-Palestinian people. They were just Israeli hooligans from a football match. I mean, how many British football teams go abroad, go to Europe, and our fans, destroy things and beat people up? And to be fair, we're rightly called out for it. But this time it's Israel, so the media essentially get behind them and say, "Oh, it's clearly anti-Semitic." Even for the Memorial Day Trust to get involved,
I mean,
that's really insane.
That's the really grotesque element of this. You would expect the media to come out and do their usual bullshit because essentially they're bought and paid for shills of Zionist interest. That's all that's there, right? But the Holocaust Memorial Trust should have something more to them than this. They should understand the dynamics of what's going on here. Again, not to harp on a point too much, but this is the city of Anne Frank. And Ajax is a team that has a strong traditional link with the Jewish community of the Netherlands in the way that various other clubs around the world, Tottenham Hotspur here in the United Kingdom, for instance, they're thought of as a traditionally Jewish club, even though, of course, most of the supporters are not themselves Jewish. They do have a strong link to that football club. So the idea that this is some sort of Nazi-run hellscape is clearly and obviously ridiculous. And again, we have to go back to the sort of poison at the heart of Israeli society. It was reported that in the Jerusalem Post 3 days ago that Mossad agents would be travelling with the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. Now, far be it from me to ever gain in any kind of conspiracy here, but we know that Mossad have acted as agent provocateur in situations that they know will allow Israel to play the victim.
And there's been instances when they've been over here when there's been pro-Palestinian marches.
Exactly,
and they've done it, and that's not a conspiracy. I mean, sometimes they just admit it, but it's antagonism to And would you say this? What happened in Amsterdam is almost by design. You want it to look like this because then they can say, "Oh, look, the whole world is against
Yeah.
Jewish people. Therefore, Israel has to engage in genocide because it's Israel versus the entire world."
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty obviously the case that this is
Yeah,
sort of a staged event, as it were, because Israel had planes on standby to go to the Netherlands from Israel in order to pick these fans up.
yeah,
Okay, so this is what they wanted to happen. They once again have interfered with what should have been a peaceful event, made it violent in order to play the victim and therefore cover up the fact that they are still ongoing the genocide of the Palestinian people. In fact, this is very much, I think, to deflect from the fact that they literally announced 3 days ago that northern Gazans would not be allowed
yeah.
their right to return to their homes. So it was a land grab. It was never about hostages. It was never about defeating the evil Hamases or anything. It was about stealing land. It's about Zionism doing
And
what
remember,
Zionism has always done.
that was supposed to be a conspiracy theory. When we called it out ages ago. People have been calling it
Yeah.
out for years. It's about land grab, and they're only pushing people to other areas of Palestine down south, by the way, and then they bomb those so-called safe routes out, so they can land grab. And they say that's a conspiracy. Some people say it's blood libel. Well, they're literally saying it themselves now.
Yeah. Also, accusations of blood libel would be far more seriously taken if you weren't in the streets singing about the extent to which you have killed Arabs and you want
There
to
you go.
continue to kill Arabs. Like, are you not blood libeling yourselves there, Maccabi Tel Aviv?
Possibly. Now, the hysteria around uh, anti-Semitism, it's creating a culture of fear. I know me and you have spoken about this many times, but we get new viewers all the time. What Zionism is doing, what the media is perpetuating, this is harmful to Jewish people because this
Yeah.
story concerns football fans. Not every Israeli is Jewish, but when we do that, it makes them feel like that every Jewish person is facing an existential threat. Not to say that they're not facing threats and racism, they are, but it's making Jewish people scared day in day out. Is not standing up for Jewish people, is it?
No, and of course, and I think we'll probably get into this with the story also from just across the border in Germany next, I think. But the linking of all Jewish people to the heinous crimes of the Israeli state is itself an anti-Semitic trope, which used to be the exclusive regard of Nazis to try and say, look, all of the Jews want to do X, Y, and Z. Whereas now they're literally just openly saying, if you oppose Israel, you're opposing all Jewish people. So you're intrinsically linking the fate of Jewish people who have no connection to Israel, have never been there, have no interest in going there, and oppose the actions of the IDF with the IDF, with the kinds of filth like Benjamin Netanyahu, right? That puts Jewish people at risk. That undermines the seriousness with which Jewish culture should be taken around the world and endangers Jewish people in situations that needn't be there. And, as you said, makes them scared constantly of things that, whilst there's certainly an element of it, anti-Semitism has been on the rise in a very serious way. And again, we'll talk about Germany shortly. But one reason that, again, undermines this is things like the not hope, not hate. The group in America, anyway, who have put down
Yes.
Israel protests as anti-Semitic actions intrinsically. So
Even just questioning Israel can
you're
sometimes be considered
overinflating the
anti-Semitic.
numbers by
Yeah.
which this is being judged, which you needn't do because there is already an increase in anti-Semitism. That's a serious thing that needs to be taken seriously. But you undermine that seriousness when you have incidents like this, where it's clear and obvious that the Zionists are at fault and were the aggressors, but you put it down as anti-Semitism.
I think you're referring to the ADL, the
The
Anti-Defamation League.
Anti-Defamation League. There we go.
Yeah. So a story came out which basically said they're going to change their definition of anti-Semitism, which includes criticisms of Israel or anti-Israel marches. Now, of course, Israel is not a protected state; it's a state, not a protected characteristic. It's a state. That's being included in anti-Semitism, and then they say, "Oh, it's on the rise, massively on the rise." It is on the rise, but it's not on the rise on the level they're claiming it is, and. We've gone on this 1,000 times. I think we are going to move on to the next story, but it basically continues the same theme. So let's move on. A resolution was passed in Germany where public funding will be restricted to critics of Israel, and this is supposedly fighting anti-Semitism. On Thursday, MPs in the German Bundestag voted for the resolution entitled "Never Again Is Now: Protecting, Preserving and Strengthening Jewish Life in Germany," which ties funding for cultural and scientific projects to support for Israel in several ways. Though legally non-binding, the resolution implies the threat of future legal action by German federal and local authorities against those who fall foul of it. The resolution says that recipients of state funding must not question Israel's right to exist, must not participate in boycotts of Israel, and must subscribe to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, a definition that is widely perceived, including by its own author, as chilling criticism of Israel. Of course, this resolution is highly controversial and has been attacked by over 100 Jewish artists. In August, a group of over 100 Jewish artists, writers and scholars living in Germany published an open letter expressing their outrage at the proposed resolution. The signatories claim the resolution would not protect, but would in fact endanger Jews in Germany by synonymizing them with Israel, a notorious anti-Semitic trope. The group added that the resolution would ironically end up targeting large numbers of non- and anti-Zionist Jews, placing thousands of Israeli and other Jewish academics and artists under suspicion by the German states. Pretty much what we were just saying then. Now, if Germany paid attention to the IHRA, they would know that one of the definitions of anti-Semitism is conflating Jewish people and Israel, which is exactly the point those artists have made. Kevin, why do you think Germany are making this move? I mean, why have they been so behind restricting freedoms? They've clamped down on pro-Palestinian protests. What are they trying to prove?
That they're not Nazis. It's simple historical guilt and understandable historical guilt. I'm glad that there is an element within German society that thinks that they have something to make up for, because I think in some historical senses they sort of do. There is a debt that I don't think can ever be truly repaid, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, sort of deal. But unfortunately, this is the exact opposite way of going about that. When they say never again means now, they don't seem to realise that they are helping never again happen right now. They are literally making another genocide take place, but because it's over there, they sort of don't care. It's a really grotesque twisting of what never again was supposed to be about. The German state, through its guild, has gone so far as to clamp down on the freedoms of its own people in a way that, unfortunately, sort of echoes, to some extent, the authoritarian governments for which they are feeling guilty in the first place. This is a non-binding resolution, partly because, as certain German academics have stated, this is clearly unconstitutional. The German constitution allows for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, and that includes up to and including boycotting countries if they so seek. The idea that this would ever be legal is ridiculous, and I'm glad that it's not going to be sort of enforced, but that's not the point. It's the chilling effect, isn't it? It's to say to people, this is an unacceptable position to have. And if you do so, there are going to be massive repercussions for you. And not for any good reason, but to defend a country currently doing a genocide because you in the past did a genocide. That's absolutely fucking unacceptable.
I mean, if you have to so-called protect someone's freedoms, a community, i.e. Jewish people, but you have to do it to restrict on other people's freedoms. You have to, I mean, when I'm going back to the quote, it's saying, you must not question Israel's right to exist.
Yeah.
Even if you agree that they should exist, you're allowed to say in a democratic society that I don't think they should exist. They're saying you cannot participate in boycotts of Israel.
That's just ridiculous.
I mean, I also don't understand how you're going to really legislate against that.
Well, exactly, that's the thing.
Unless it's going to be targeted group BDS groups. But like, if I were to know that one business is, is getting money or sending money to Israel and is actually, complicit in it, and I choose not to go to this restaurant, is there going to be a police officer saying, "Sir, why did you not go to this restaurant? Is it because it's Israeli owned?"
Exactly.
I mean, how are they going to legislate this? How are they going to do it in practice?
It can't be enforced, and
Yeah.
again, that's sort of not the point, is it?
No, of course
I
not.
mean, other than forcing you to have to buy Israeli goods and services, which again, I'm not entirely sure how that would even be possible, but it would be obviously be unconscionable and unworkable. It's not the point. The point is to chill criticism of Israel, which is really disgusting. Because if the people behind this were very serious about tackling the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, they would not be going after pro-Palestinian protesters. They would, for instance, curb the neoliberal excesses that have left the people of Eastern Germany, what was formerly the German so-called Democratic Republic, um, completely in the dust, right? They've been left behind, abandoned, economically destroyed, and left to fester. And in that swamp, monsters arise. We know this. This is how fascism comes to be. And yet the neoliberals, the very people who are responsible for the actual rise of real, virulent, nasty anti-Semitism in the forms of the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD party, and various other even more horrific movements, are the very people now lecturing us on we're being anti-Semitic. No, you are the ones leading to the rise of actual anti-Semitism and a return to the Nazism that you feel so guilty about in the first place. So how about you stop shitting on the working class of Germany and forcing them into the arms of the very fascists who are going to make Nazism rise again?
And of course, the German government has collapsed. It's not been
Yeah,
long. It
exactly. Yeah,
collapsed, and it's looking like the far right is making gains once again. So there's
yeah,
no.
because again,
Why aren't they
because
talking about them? Why are they not tackling them?
well, because that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
The neoliberals don't give a shit about that. If they wanted to tackle actual anti-Semitism, they'd stop being neoliberals, because it's that neoliberalism which has hollowed out the economic base of parts of Germany that have led to the rise of the AfD. And acknowledging that would be acknowledging their own fault and complicity in that situation. And they're never going to do that. They're never going to turn against their rich donors. They are what they are. They're neoliberal assholes, for want of a better phrase. And so they're just going to allow that situation to fester. And each election, we see the encroachment of the AfD in both state elections and in the federal government. And regardless of whether this new election happens in January or in 6 months or wherever, Scholz's party will lose significantly. Various other of the coalition parties will probably lose. Hopefully, you're going to see an increase in things like the Greens, because there needs to be a left-wing alternative and pushback against this. But ultimately, the AfD will encroach on this further and further. And it's become such an issue that they can't ignore it any longer, surely. And yet they're going to fucking try.
Well, when we come on to the Democrats later on, they are going to demonstrate that you absolutely can ignore it or try to ignore it, even in the face of something so obvious. Now, many people attacked Owen Jones when he said that Germany is overcorrecting for the past. Is what you just said.
Yeah.
But you know, but it's strange because backing a fascist movement, which is Zionism, that's not an overcorrection. It's just a continuation of Germany and fascism working together. So Owen Jones is completely correct, and you say it too. It's the guilt from the past, and that guilt is good, but they're using that guilt to then reinforce the same thing they've always done.
Yeah.
It's
Also, it's always funny the degree to which the Owen Jones derangement syndrome has taken over some people's brains. There is no issue they won't turn into Owen Jones as a monster. Literally, you could the goat herding in Uzbekistan. Oh, it's Owen Jones's fault. You know, they're crazy.
I mean, did you see the it's slightly off topic. Did you see the new European attack Owen Jones because he was critical of Kamala Harris's Israel-Palestine policy, and obviously he called out a lot, and they were trying to blame him for he was apparently part of the reason why she lost. I didn't know he had that much influence. If he had that much influence, I'm pretty sure we'd have socialism today.
Well, one would think so, certainly,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, it's that's obviously patently nonsense. The reason that she lost in places like Michigan was because of her policies. Places that had large Arab Muslim populations, and when I say large, it's relative, of course. It was still talking, south of 10%, but even so, they did unbelievably poorly, which is not surprising. No one wants to vote for a genocide. Even those of them that did had to hold their nose and do
Yeah.
so, and probably
Yeah.
felt dirty having to do so, because there's the utilitarian calculus that whilst Harris is bad, Trump is going to be worse, and we are going to see that, unfortunately. No one wants to vote for that. Ultimately, the reason that Kamala Harris lost, and we'll get onto this shortly, is partly down to Kamala Harris and partly down to Joe Biden,
Yeah.
as well as a number of other factors, of course.
Oh, we certainly will get into that conversation. But we're going to move on. But before we go on to our next story, I just want to say, if you like to support Turn Left's growth, then please share this video, spread the word to friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now, as I've said many a times, unless you're a new viewer, there's 5 of us working as volunteers. We have a producer in the background right now. There's me and there's a couple of others who rotate our positions. But our goal is to one day make this our full-time work. So, if you're able to, please visit turnleftmedia.co.uk/support, where you can contribute monthly on our Patreon or make a one-off donation. Your support will help us upgrade equipment, create more ambitious content, and ultimately build a dedicated studio. So the plan is to create a socialist media alternative together. Thank you so much to everyone who's watching. I think we're going to take a look at some of our comments. Let's see what you've got in store for us. Hakan, I mean, my screen's a bit too small. I can't see it. Hakan Ozalan, not shocked. Oh, with a €5 super chat. Thank you very much. Not shocked, not surprised about the media's anti-Semitism spin. It's like even when they attack brown people on European soil, they get a pass. Precisely. I mean, there's no bigger victim in people's eyes in the media than it is for the Jewish community, and they are a victim, but so is everybody else. And I think that's when we get into the conversation about the hierarchy of racism. But it's not even about anti-Semitism; it's about anti-Israel sentiment, and they're conflating the two. FSM is the dog. FIFA sanctioned Russia, but not Israel. Go figure. Exactly what Kevin said. We should be boycotting these Israel's cultural institutions. I find it absolutely unconscionable that Israel's committing a genocide, yet they're playing football.
Yeah.
No,
it's absolutely unacceptable, let alone the geographic situation that they're not in Europe. So why the hell are they even playing as part of the European qualification? Which is a rather more philosophical point, I suppose. But yeah, they should have been sanctioned. I was all for Russia being removed from both World Cup and European Championship qualifications, as well as the domestic and continental tournaments. And I think that should happen to Israel as well. I would also argue that I think it should probably happen to Hungary, given its fascist government as well. But, that's a broader topic, I suppose.
Edward Sexby, so the way of getting over fascism is to introduce fascistic measures to protect a country practicing fascist policies. It's precisely that, which is why when we say Germany feels like it's overcorrecting or they're guilty, but they're not overcorrecting, they're doing the same thing. It's not that they've gone far the other way. They're doing the same thing by backing fascistic movements, and Zionism is a fascistic movement.
But I mean, you say that, but there's definitely an element of this because the connection between leftism and football in Germany. There's a club called St. Pauli, which is based in the city of Hamburg, which is a very well-known leftist, and I mean properly leftist, or football club. Very strong anarchist and communist tendencies throughout its football club. Literally, they fly flags of Che Guevara at home matches and stuff. It's really out there stuff, and even there's been like a split in the fandom on the basis that in Germany, the left are much more pro-Israel because of that historical overcorrection and not wanting to be seen as anti-Semitic and all of that. And the international fandom of people going, look, what the fuck? You're supposed to be leftists and you're supporting the country doing the genocide? That's mad. So there is definitely a paralysis within German society when it comes to the issue of Israel because they don't want to be, asked like, oh, why are you being exactly like your granddad?
No, it's absolutely true. German leftists are quite a lot of them are horrendous on the issue. We do see it.
It's a real problem.
Carmack MCC. As long as the Greens don't get too co-opted like the German Greens. I mean, people accusing the Greens of doing that already with their stance on NATO, which, I mean, for me, call me a lib, but I'm like, it's. I feel like talk about other issues for now. Don't Don't go
Yeah,
fighting on NATO right now
it's
when we're quite an authoritarian country as it is. Quite,
you don't, yeah, like you've got 5 MPs.
Mm.
Whether or not to join NATO is not an issue you even need to talk about.
Precisely. So, but
Fine.
I mean, I'm assuming you're meaning more to do with foreign policy, I guess, and not in terms of NATO, but maybe to do with Israel, Palestine. I'm not sure, but there's always a chance because I'm very skeptical of a lot of green parties worldwide. I do feel like we have probably one of the best in the world. But yeah. Any other comments? That
Free
is
Palestine.
it. Free Palestine. Yes.
That's my comment.
One I completely agree with. So let's move on to our next story. So Yoav Gallant has been fired by Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has fired his defense minister Yoav Gallant, a figure widely considered by Israel's international allies to be a brake on the far-right elements of the country's coalition government, prompting protests around Israel. Netanyahu said in a video statement late on Tuesday that significant gaps on handling the battle in Gaza had emerged. At the height of a war, complete trust is needed between the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. In recent months, that trust between me and the Defence Minister was damaged, he said. The move prompted protests across the country. We actually have some of that footage of the protest now.
I'm here tonight because the government is again failing us. In the middle of a war, they are really firing a minister that is the only minister that we thought he cares. He cares for the people that are abducted in Gaza, and he cares for the soldiers, and he really cares for the country.
Likud party member and current foreign minister Israel Katz is to be the replacement. Kevin, I'd like to get your initial thoughts on this move from Netanyahu.
Yeah, clearly Gallant was going to be something of a check on some of the excesses of the Netanyahu government. He was one of the very few senior politicians in the coalition who spoke out against his judicial reforms, which were, when I say judicial reforms, he wanted to nerf the Israeli judiciary so that he would be essentially immune from prosecution for his many and varied corruption crimes. So the fact that he had some semblance of principle there meant he was always going to kind of clash to a degree with Netanyahu. But I do have to somewhat push back on the wording of the article, and indeed much of the press on this. When they say he was a curb on the excesses of the far right on this, he is the far right on this as well. He's not like this. He's some like misunderstood liberal in the sea of fascists. No, he's just the tiniest shade less fascist than the other fascists who are the fascist government of Israel. He is a genocidal Zionist freak. That's what he is. So no one needs to feel sorry for him personally, but this is clearly an attempt by Netanyahu to stamp out any semblance of independence from the war cabinet. And to further the Zionist claims over northern Gaza, and indeed to further their expansionist intent in southern Lebanon as well.
I mean, I agree with the wording. In fact, in my script, I write about that. I mean, in that paragraph, it states that the international allies think that Gallant was a break on the far right. I mean, yes, he is the far right, and he's hardly done much to restrict Netanyahu. I mean, he's used legal procedures, okay, but he hasn't stopped the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who've been killed. So I think we can safely assume that Netanyahu thinks he's being restrained. And this new appointment means it's only going to get much worse, especially now with Trump being in the White House from January.
Yeah, I mean, this is undoubtedly timed with a certain amount with that in mind. Because he knows he's going to get absolute carte blanche. We know this. Sheldon Adelson's widow, literally in the lead up to the election, it was discussed with Trump that her financial support was absolutely predicated on Trump acceding to the full annexation of the Gaza Strip. So that's what we have to look forward to. That's what is undoubtedly going to become US policy and indeed Israeli state policy. Because again, it was never about hostages. It was never about defeating terrorism. It was about land grabbing. It was about expansion. But yeah, in what way can Gallant say that he did actually hold back the Netanyahu government? I mean, what would he have done without that being held back? Was he going to invade the moon? Like, what was left for him to do exactly?
Precisely.
Like,
Yeah.
if this is him being restrained, God only knows what he's going to be like off the leash, I suppose.
Well, which is probably what we're going to see now, because it is obviously Yoav Gallant gone, but again, I refer to Trump again. Trump is far worse than this issue, and he's now going to be the most powerful man in the world, backing Israel. I do want to get your thoughts on the video we had of the protest. Now, of course, they're not pro-Palestine protests. I mean, they were singing Yoav Gallant's praises. But what does it say that even people who are on board with the project essentially are now angry at Netanyahu for this? I mean, it's not there. What do you think's going through people's minds?
It's not massively surprising. We saw earlier on during the war when Netanyahu basically abandoned all chances of actually getting hostages back.
Yeah.
They were literally offered a deal: stop the war and we'll hand the hostages back. And he said, "Nah, fuck that noise," and carried on doing his thing. And there were massive protests in the street. Most of whom are Zionists. Most of Israeli society is unfortunately Zionist. It is the very much the rot at the core, the cancerous tumor, which eats away at the soul of that nation. Most of those people are Zionists, but they actually don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a phenomenally unpopular man, and literally one of the key underwritten parts of this entire affair is that this has gone on as long as it has because Benjamin Netanyahu is looking after himself and his wife to an extent. Because as soon as this war ends, he stops being prime minister and he goes to jail for his crimes. So he's just keeping this going. He's just keeping this going longer and longer and longer so that he can find some way to get diplomatic immunity.
Yeah.
That's all that's taking place there. He's killing hundreds of thousands of people just to avoid justice for his crimes.
I mean, it's clear that his facade isn't working, as you've described, as we've seen in the footage there. And yeah, Netanyahu is unpopular, so people aren't buying into the idea that everything he's doing is in the interest of national security. But then that to me then says, well, if you know he's doing this to prolong the war, why aren't you, protesting earlier? I mean, I suppose they have.
They have, but unfortunately, the Israeli state has a way of turning the fascism inward, because that's what always happens, of course.
True, yes.
We've seen with the very noble Orthodox community in Israel, who've, not all of them, of course, but a great many, who have campaigned vociferously within Israel against the occupation and against the IDF and the Israeli government's actions. And they've been brutally suppressed by the authorities. Because again, this is not about defending Jewish people, it's about defending Zionism. Zionism is the cancer upon Judaism. It's as simple as that. It's a cancer upon the Jewish communities around the world and in Israel. If you oppose in any respect the ultra-Zionist push, they will use any and all methods, up to and including Mossad subversion, in order to destroy you. Because again, they don't mind hurting Jewish people if it helps Zionism.
Sorry, just checking my mic there because I've had people saying it's a bit quiet. I've turned myself up. Hopefully that's better. I'm apparently on full volume, but I've got my own control.
I'll just move further back from my microphone.
That might work. I was going to ask you kind of a hypothetical then. Had Kamala Harris won, okay? I know that Joe Biden said he's himself said he is a Zionist.
Yes.
I don't know whether Kamala has actually said, I am a Zionist. I mean, she's obviously been complicit. But an alternative timeline, Kamala Harris is president, and you're getting more and more people unhappy with Benjamin Netanyahu, more and more protests. Could there have been a slight inflection point there where the US could have potentially used that and exploited that sort of hole within the Israeli government to try and curb them a little bit? I mean, I don't believe that the US State Department wants Israel to do what they're doing. I think they're complicit, and I don't think they care enough, but I don't think they want to, as in Trump wants that to happen. So could have that been a real change there?
I think so. The problem with actually drawing that comparison when eventually Trump gets in and starts doing this stuff is that we can only compare it to a hypothetical of what Kamala Harris might have done. So it's less concrete than we would, I suppose, ideally like. But I think there's no doubt that whilst I don't think she's ever really called herself a Zionist, that's a distinction without a difference. She has actively supported the Zionist cause. She's been the vice president for Genocide Joe. So I don't really care whether she calls herself that or not. She fundamentally is one. But I think, like you say, the US State Department don't want this because it's embarrassing. It's, in fact, incredibly difficult on a diplomatic level for them to have to negotiate this. So what I think would have happened was you would have seen behind-the-scenes moves from the United States to try and install, I mean, it's going to be another Zionist and another piece of shit, but a piece of shit who doesn't have a personal vested interest in keeping the war going in order to not be in jail, and have them replace Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister and then come to some sort of arrangement, because this at the very least is a thorn in the side for America, because it makes the idea of international rules-based order so ridiculous. There's no way we can sit here and say to finger wag of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or anyone else about international law, whilst at the same time going, no, Israel has carte blanche to just like slaughter children and stuff. That's fine. I mean, it's ridiculous.
You hit the nail on the head. It's like they're not the US State Department and the current administration. Yeah, they don't want Israel to do what they're doing. Not really out of care of the Palestinians, but it is a thorn in the side. They're continually trying to make excuses for Israel, and it's making the US look like hypocrites. The difference, though, is that, once again, Trump is fully behind this. So it almost feels like, I mean, it's probably well-timed, actually, that Yoav Gallant went with Trump winning. Actually, it's more than likely, so I guess it doesn't really make a difference. But you could say if this wasn't timed and this happened, it just so happens that Trump now wins. Again, these are all hypotheticals, but I did find that quite interesting. I think we are going to move on to our final story, though. Sticking with the US now. Many people were shocked at the results of the US election, which saw Donald Trump make a comeback, and it wasn't even close. Kamala Harris lost 15 million votes at the time of counting, compared to Joe Biden in 2020. Now, Democrats are looking inward, trying to figure out what went wrong and what they should do in the future. Unsurprisingly, they seem to be learning the wrong lessons.
Is Latinx, because that's the politically correct thing to do. It makes them think that we don't even live on the same planet as they do. When we are too afraid to say that, hey, college kids, if you're trashing a campus at Columbia University because you're unhappy about some sort of policy and you're taking over a university and you're trashing it and preventing other students from learning, that is unacceptable. But we're so worried about alienating one or another cohort in our coalition that we don't know what to say when normal people look at that and say, wait a second, I send my kids to college so they can learn, not so that they can burn buildings and trash lawns, right? And so on and so forth. When we put pronouns after names and say she, her, as opposed to saying, you know what, if I call you by the wrong pronoun, call me out, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. But stop with the virtue signaling.
And I also think a lot of young people are also fed up with very super progressive attitudes. I think the Democrats, Joe, going back to your initial question, and you may disagree with this, I think they need to move to the center. I think the
What
center.
does that mean, though? When you say they need to move to the center, what do they need? Are you saying that they should not support trans people? Like, let's just be specific, because that's what the ads are doing. So if the analysis and the immediate aftermath is they have to move to the center, I mean, what is the center? Because I disagree that is it, but I want to hear what is the center, because you're not the only person, to be clear, I've heard say that. Yeah. I've heard, the Democrats been in my phone this morning.
The center are the people I described before. I'm not even talking about an issue. We can talk about issues. The people I described before who bounce back and forth, who play between the 45-yard lines, that tends to win elections. If you look historically where it is. So that's my feeling.
So the lessons from Democrats and pundits is that they need to move towards the centre, even though they are already there, or centre-right if we're going to be more accurate. The issue is pronouns, wokery, and students protesting genocide. We also can't let him get away with saying the centre wins elections. I mean, we just had Donald Trump deploy the most right-wing campaign for decades with literal Hitler quotes, and he won. Now, at least we have one prominent figure who has a sensible response. Bernie Sanders put out a statement with a scathing attack on the Democratic establishment. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change, and they are right. Today, while the very rich are doing phenomenally well, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and we have more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Unbelievably, real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the average American worker are actually lower now than they were 50 years ago. Today, despite an explosion in technology and worker productivity, many young people will have a worse standard of living than their parents, and many of them worry that artificial intelligence and robotics will make a bad situation even worse. Today, despite spending far more per capita than any other country, we remain the only wealthy nation not to guarantee healthcare to all as a human right, and we pay, by far, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We alone, among major countries, cannot even guarantee paid family and medical leave. Today, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government's all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take an increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power? Probably not. In the coming weeks and months, those of us concerned about grassroots democracy and economic justice need to have some very serious political discussions. Stay tuned. What a statement. Now, after he made that statement, he was then attacked by the DNC chair, Jamie Harrison. This is straight up bullshit. Biden was the most pro-worker president of my lifetime, saved union pensions, created millions of good-paying jobs, and even marched in the picket line. And some of MVP's plans would have fundamentally transformed the quality of life and closed the racial wealth gap for working people across the country. Now, granted, Joe Biden did have some good Labour policies, but it's clear it wasn't enough. And according to Harrison, he doesn't seem to agree with Bernie. Kevin, I'd like to get your response to the Democratic establishment, the pundits, and Jamie Harrison, because the issue for them isn't to move left. They're probably arguing we need to be more right-wing.
To quote the great Patrick Stewart as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, do not trust the liberals. They will betray you. Yeah, this is exactly what these fucking people always do. They will snatch defeat from the jaws of victory and then tell you it's your fucking fault. If there is one thing that this election is it's a repudiation of centrist politics, completely and utterly. As you point out, Donald Trump ran the most far-right campaign we've seen since probably Barry Goldwater, and possibly even worse than Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, and won. And not just that, but won the popular vote. At time of recording, California still is counting, so she might just catch him. But regardless of that, it looks like he'll probably win the popular vote, which is absolutely ludicrous. But there we go. And the Democratic Party, if you look at the timeline of it, it's perfect for the argument I'm trying to make here, right? At the start of her campaign, and we'll get on to why her campaign started so late in a second, but when it started, she was making much more progressive noises. She chose in Tim Walz probably the most realistic progressive option available. She could have gone with the far more conservative Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania. She didn't. She went with a more progressive guy who's done much more progressive things as the governor of Minnesota. She matched Trump's no taxes on tipped work, which is, just standard social democratic, good, solid, working class policy, right? She was making genuinely progressive noises, and there was momentum. She'd gone from, or the Democratic candidate had gone from being like in the absolute water to being in the lead. consistently all the way until Jonathan Ashworth, lol, but more importantly, less memey, but very seriously, when she got Hillary Clinton on board and Hillary Clinton's advisors. Why on earth you would possibly go to the person who lost to Donald Trump for advice on this, I'm not entirely sure. And she started rowing back towards the center and the center right. That's when her campaign stalled. That's when her numbers went through the fucking floor. And that's ultimately why she lost. She prayed in aid Dick Cheney's support. Dick Cheney, a man less popular than gonorrhea. And she was like, yay, he supports me. Why are you doing that? Why are you possibly fucking doing that? She refused to back trans people, which ultimately puts a lie to the idea that this is people being too woke. She wasn't fucking woke in the slightest. She said she was going to have a Republican in her cabinet. She said she was going to have a bipartisan committee to develop policy. So basically, she was saying, I am just going to be another Republican. So no wonder progressives said, fuck you then. Of course they were going to say that. And you know what? Ultimately, if you look at it, Donald Trump got 91% of self-confessed conservatives in 2020. This time round, even though she tried desperately to get conservatives, mild conservatives, edge case, people who didn't want to vote for Donald Trump but sort of were going to come over, he got 93%. So all of you, this pushing to the right, trying to get moderate Republicans on your side, ended up with him having a +2 swing in conservatives. You can't win these people over. But what you did do was alienate millions and millions of Americans by supporting genocide, by not supporting basic bread and butter policies, as Bernie Sanders outlined. You abandoned any kind of progressivism, and now you're turning around and saying, oh, it's the left wing's fault. It's not the left wing's fault. It's centrism's fault. It's neoliberalism's fault. That's who's to blame here. And ultimately, as bad as Kamala Harris's campaign was, she was hold below the waterline by the fact that she had so little time to even put it together. Joe Biden, this wizened cadaver of a human being who clearly was not fit to be running for president. He was barely fucking fit to be doing that in 2016 or 2020. He definitely wasn't in 2024. And yet decided he wanted to run, even though he'd promised he was going to be a one-term guy. He just wanted to get rid of Trump. He'd serve his one term and get out of the way. He didn't. He allowed hubris and selfishness to Trump, ironically, better reasoning. And we could have had a proper open primary, gotten the best candidate who was actually popular amongst Democratic voters, but instead we ended up with the guy that nobody wanted. One of the most unpopular presidents of ever. Look at his numbers, and yet he still wanted to run. What an absolute prick.
And ironically, if there was an open primary, Kamala probably would have won it because she's VP. Okay.
Very possibly, but at least then you have a proper run into the election. That's the thing. You can't just establish a presidential campaign in no time. Think of the geographic landmass you have to campaign in here. You can't just magic that infrastructure out of nowhere. You can't magic $1 billion out of fucking nowhere. Although she still actually managed that, which was pretty impressive. She did reasonably well in that regard. It's just the policy that let her down, really. And it's interesting that she refused to distance herself from Biden, but Biden now, having seen that she's lost, is distancing himself from his own vice president.
That's the thing. He's probably now thinking, had I stayed in the race, I would have won. Now, he would have won. I mean, he wouldn't have won, sorry. It would have been worse, actually, because the guy is cognitively completely declined. So it would have been even worse of a loss. But he's probably thinking that. In fact, I think one of his spokesperson was like, well, Biden's the only one that beat Trump. I do actually want to go to that now. And I think all of us, not just liberals, but I think maybe those of us on the left are recalibrating a little bit. I had a belief that when Joe Biden won in 2020, that Trump was like a one-trick pony, right? In 2016, Hillary Clinton was just so unpopular. The campaign she ran was terrible. His campaign was very effective. He pretended to sound like a left-wing economic populist. He was talking about TPP. He was talking about these NAFTA. He was talking about these disastrous trade deals that the establishment engaged in, which ships loads of people's jobs overseas. And Hillary Clinton was quite a big proponent of it, right? That was actually quite a good campaign. Obviously, it was still very sexist and racist and whatever. But then when Joe Biden won in 2020, I was like, maybe it's because Hillary Clinton was uniquely unpopular that actually Trump is an unelectable candidate, should we say, and got a fluke and won. Watching this back now with Kamala Harris losing so badly, I actually think Joe Biden won a fluke. In fact, it was because of COVID. So Joe Biden probably wouldn't have beaten Trump in a normal election, but because of COVID, people tend to look at their conditions and their very recent memory and think what life was like, and they thought it was shit under Trump, because actually the economy played a large role in this, inflation for example. And the question from the Trump side is, does your life feel better now than it did before? Now, tangibly, people's lives haven't really improved, but like on a small scale, the economy is doing better now than it was then, but people don't respond to that if it's not in a big way.
Yeah.
I think it was actually a fluke from Joe Biden. I do want to ask you though, how much do you think that the alt media played into this campaign? I mean, the Democrats largely stuck to legacy media. Harris didn't appear on Joe Rogan, whereas Trump's campaign, they had zero ground game, by the way. Anyone who's in the US, a lot of our British pundits went over there and said he has no ground game, whereas Kamala Harris's ground game was quite impressive. His campaign was terminally online. I mean, they were talking about obscure memes, at times, and they fully embraced new media. Obviously, that worked for them. So do you think things could have been different, or at least not so much of a bad defeat for Harris, had she taken new media more seriously?
I think the Democrats and more either liberal / left people in general have to get a better grip on this, which is something I've been warning about for a long time. I mean, I would say I hate to say I told you so, but I don't. I love to say I told you so. I've been doing videos about the kind of radicalization of young men for a long time now. I've been doing this nearly a decade, I suppose, and sort of chronicling it content free for a while, but even before then. And I could have told you this. They're lighting fires underneath very dangerous young people. I think it is a little overblown, the effect to which this has had, because if you look at the demographics, young white men did overwhelmingly vote for Trump, but not in much higher numbers than white men generally. So the radicalization of young white men narrative isn't quite right. I think what we're underplaying and underselling as a factor here is misogyny and racism. Hillary Clinton undoubtedly suffered from some of the misogyny angle of this, and Kamala Harris definitely has as well. And she has the added factor of being a black person.
Yep.
And being very racistly treated by the Trump campaign and all the rest of it, with her like, is she Indian or is she black? All that fucking nonsense at the start. That definitely didn't help, and I think you can see that in the demographic breakdown of how white people voted as opposed to other people. You can see the misogyny angle if you look at how men voted compared to how women voted. I think I saw one graph that suggested that if it was only women that voted, she'd have won 400 electoral college votes and virtually every major urban centre, urban conurbation state in the entire union. So the takeaway from this shouldn't be ignore new media, but it should also be don't overreact to it. The idea that her not going on Joe Rogan was some big thing. Joe Rogan viewers, I will just reveal this massive secret to you now, are reactionary filth. They just are. I despise you if you listen to Joe Rogan for anything other than like yucks. If you're laughing at him, that's fine. But if you're an actual, like, if you think he has anything of worth or sense to say, you're an idiot, and he's a fucking idiot. Except he's a rich idiot at the very least. You're the idiot paying for it. She didn't need to go on Joe Rogan because she wouldn't have gotten anywhere. As I pointed out, pandering to conservatives was never going to win for her, and it didn't. She pandered to conservatives for the entire second half of the presidential run that she had, and it got her nowhere. No conservatives came over to her because they were never going to come over to her. You tried to court right-wing votes, and they didn't go anywhere. Trump basically had the exact same support that he had previously. If you look at the numbers, his vote this year was basically the same as it was 4 years ago. It was the Democratic
I think
base
he had
that
3 million
crumbled.
less votes, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, statistically, that's within the
Statistically,
margin
it's
of error,
yeah,
really.
it's
So it's pretty level. Whereas she lost, or the Democratic candidate lost, significant numbers of votes because you weren't appealing to them. You weren't even trying to. You took their votes for granted, and they went, "Well, fuck you then," and stayed at home. That's the lesson to take away from this: is don't take people for granted. It's got nothing to do, by the way, as well. Just to push back on this weird transphobic bullshit that people are putting out there. Firstly, she didn't campaign on trans issues at all. She didn't use the pronoun thing or any of this. When she was asked about this, she just said we should follow the law. She basically threw trans people under the bus, and they still said, "Oh, they focus too much on woke stuff." It's bollocks. It's absolute bollocks. I can understand trans people being very scared right now, and indeed a lot of other people being very scared right now. But know this: the Democratic Party took you for granted, and unfortunately, their malfeasance in government and their lack of giving a fuck about you at the ballot box ultimately is going to hurt you and not them, and that's a fucking damn shame. But don't let it undermine you as a person. Don't let fear consume you or become blackpilled by this. Allow that energy within inside yourself right now, which feels very negative, to become something positive. Use that as constructive energy to organize in your community, join trade unions, join local groups, anything in your local community, food banks, homeless shelters, whatever. Do something positive for your community, because it's going to be a bad 4 years. There's no doubt about it. But ultimately, we need to stop relying on what a politician is going to do and decide for ourselves what we're going to fucking do and create the world we want to exist.
I just want to say, liberals and centrists never, ever learn their lessons. They're so ideologically wedded to the centre ground or their brand of politics, they'll never learn. Now, what we're hearing from the Democratic establishment is we must blame wokeness, we must blame pronouns or trans people. That's the reason why. And I'm sick of this, because it's not just America. We get this in the UK. We had it after Jeremy Corbyn.
Yep.
Even before Jeremy Corbyn, it was, we only win elections in the centre ground. Bullshit. And I call bullshit for two reasons. One, this election in the US, as I mentioned before, Donald Trump ran the most right-wing, the most sexist, racist, disgusting campaign for decades, maybe the worst ever. I mean, at least like Gary Goldwater, you alluded to. And he won, okay? Whenever the Conservatives in the UK pivot to the right, okay, no one ever says, do you know what? They need to become more left-wing to win elections. They never say that. It's only ever on progressive parties. And why do they say that? It's because centrists and liberals always side with the right over the left. They disagree with the left ideologically. So they're not saying you need to appeal to the centre because they think you can win. They're saying that because they hate your politics. They hate our politics. In 2017, right, Jeremy Corbyn won 40% of the vote. He added 3 million votes. 10% of the vote from Ed Miliband, who lost a terrible defeat with 30% of the vote, right? He increased seats, he increased vote share, he mobilised people. He didn't win, but it was a hung parliament, right? Even Corbyn's biggest critics, inside and outside the Labour Party, for maybe about a week, shut the fuck up. I wish they'd shut the fuck up forever, but they did it for just a week. Then obviously, there was a 2019 election, and the Conservatives won, but he still got 32% of the vote. Fast forward to 2024, Keir Starmer wins. Yes, it's a huge majority, but that was with less votes than both 2019 and 2017, and only because the Conservatives collapsed, right? There were the Liberals for a very short minute celebrated that centrism is back. Keir Starmer's revived centrism. Joe Biden in 2020 revived centrism. It is not back, right? It's gone. We are in an era of populism. Trump won on a populist campaign. Reform are rising in this country because of populism. If Keir Starmer continues the way he is governing, which he will, reform will make huge gains. I even think Nigel Farage could become Prime Minister in the future. And the centrists and the liberals hate populism. But the only way to defeat the far right, the only way to defeat fascism is left-wing populism. That's it. They do not understand this, and they're going to lose over and over again. And if the Democratic establishment have their own way, if they ignore people like Bernie Sanders, it's going to be J.D. Vance. It's going to be someone even worse than Trump. And it's going to be all on them. Now, that is all we have time for. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Thank you again, Kevin, for coming on. Remember, if you haven't liked the stream, please make sure you do, as it helps with the algorithm. If you want to see Turn Left grow, then make sure you share this video online, tell your friends and family about us. And if you're not subscribed, make sure you do. I'm Curtis Daly. I want to thank everyone who's been watching tonight. Before we end the show, please, if you can, consider becoming a supporter by going to turnleftmedia.co.uk/supports. You can support us on our Patreon monthly or any one-off donation. Again, I'm Curtis Daly. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back this Sunday for our debrief podcast, so tune in then, and I will see you next time.
Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn Left.